Hello and welcome to Super Atheist Bros, Episode 6. I am Turtle, along with Gavagai.
Hello.
Today we are going to be talking about a number of subjects, mostly kind of under the umbrella of Jesus as a historical figure and the question of whether Jesus was a liar, lunatic, Lord, legend, or other. Under that umbrella, we're going to be discussing um, uh, a recent documentary. I think it was from 2012 or 13, but the documentary was called "Searching for Sugar Man," and it doesn't talk about Jesus, but we want to kind of talk about some um, things that kind of mirror the story of Jesus, or at least how Jesus became the figure he is today. And in addition to that, we're going to be talking a bit about Bart Ehrman's new book, How Jesus Became God. But before we get into all that, we have some follow-up thoughts to last week's discussion on the new Planet of the Apes movie. Gavagai, do you want to go ahead and give us your thoughts on?
Sure. Yeah. So, as after we kind of finished our discussion, there was one kind of last thing that I wanted to also mention related to some of the other topics that we talked about last week, and it was kind of neat. A lot of our topics kind of uh, had a link together about just this the idea about our beliefs and thoughts affecting our actions and things. We talked about Kem Ham and his alien blogs and things like that, and the dangers of violence that results from ideologies and things where if the ideology becomes so important to a person's beliefs about their own safety and things, that violence can come about that way. And a point that we kind of just grazed over a little bit was with Koba, one of the characters from the new Planet of the Apes movies. He becomes entrenched in this ideology that their safety depended upon uh, their community's willingness to fight, and because that ideology and it was really based in fear.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback here.
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, shoot, it's it's very distracting because I'm
Are you hearing yourself?
yes. There's apparently another window open here somewhere. That's there it is. Okay, sorry about that. But anyhow, it was repeating what I said a few minutes ago and very distracting to me. I'm
I would
sorry.
imagine that would be distracting.
So at any rate, Koba, his actions really become completely entrenched in this idea that they were all in danger and that he needed to act, and he his ideology really took precedent over any kind of moral constraints or considerations, and he took actions that I think he would not have normally thought were good or justified or moral, um, because his ideology was based in fear. And so that was just one point that I wanted to draw out. But you had something else that you kind of wanted to add to our apes discussion last week as well, didn't you?
Well, yeah. Actually, after we uh, talked about the new films, I ended up watching the first two of the original series, and I hadn't seen them in probably just over a decade, but I had forgotten just how uh, anti-religious the first one in particular is. Not against any religion in particular, but religion is really the bad guy in that movie, and I had forgotten how much uh, that was the case, which I found interesting because I can't think anything really in modern film that really compares at this point in time. I feel like in some ways films are more edgy, but in other ways they aren't. And just watching that movie again, I was surprised at how negatively religion is portrayed, intentionally. And I was just a little bit surprised by that. Another thing, and not related to that, was how much of an asshole Charlton Heston's character is. Uh, like he's such an arrogant jackass throughout most of that movie. And then spoilers for the second movie, but he ends up blowing up the entire world. Like that's how the second one ends, with Taylor blowing up the entire Earth, basically. So because things were like the apes, humans had ruined their run, and he didn't care for the way apes were running things. So to hell with everybody, and he ends up setting off a nuke that burns up the entire atmosphere of the Earth, and the entire planet is dead because of this one guy in his disapproval of how things have gone. So I thought that was an interesting way to present your. And he really isn't the protagonist of the second film, but he's definitely the protagonist of the first film, and then he makes a bit of a cameo in the second one, and in so doing blows up the Earth. So just thought that was an interesting.
It's not a very what's the word? Confidence or I don't know, flattering depiction of mankind. If we were responsible for destroying it once, and that wasn't good enough, so the one or two people who are left end up blowing it up again.
Yeah, well, and that's part of what makes Taylor such an unlikable character, I think, in the first one, is because he's right off the bat. He's set up. He's talking. I don't know if you remember, but the first couple minutes take place on their spaceship, and Charlton Heston is just sitting there talking into a microphone, recording his thoughts before he goes into his sleep. But he's at one point he says something to the effect of, "There's got to be something better out there," meaning better than mankind. And then after they crash land, him and his one of his fellow survivors are talking, and talking about why he took up the mission, and he basically is saying how kind of along those lines, he was looking for something better out there, meaning better than mankind. But even with, which is fine, but there's this kind of at least from my point of view, this implication that Taylor himself views himself as better. Like humanity's got all these problems, but he's smart enough to recognize that and get out of there. He doesn't want to be lumped in with those knuckleheads, so he gets out of there. And then, at the end of the film, you find out how bad humanity was, and they ended up blowing up their civilization, and the apes take over. But just right off the bat, he's a pretty unlikable character in my opinion. But throughout the film, he's just this arrogant prick. But you're supposed to root for him. But
well, he's so devilishly handsome.
Oh yeah, and I don't really think Charlton Heston is a very good actor, but whatever. But I think that about wraps up the apes follow-up. So let's move on. And these next couple topics, like I said, are going to kind of fall a bit under this larger umbrella of Jesus as a historical figure. But first, I want to touch on this documentary and what the documentary is about. And as I mentioned in the last episode, if you haven't seen this documentary, I kind of recommend you actually check it out before listening to the rest of this. But it's not super. How did you end up finding the the documentary. I had a friend that bought it. But how did you end up getting a hold of it, Gavigai?
My brother Turtle told me about it.
But I mean, how did you end up like? Because it's not on Netflix, I don't think, is it?
Yeah, it was.
Oh, it was? Okay, well then, yeah. If I didn't think it was on Netflix, but all right, cool. Yeah, if you have Netflix, maybe stop and check it out on Netflix if it's still up now. Um,
Yeah,
but
either I said that it was either on Netflix or I saw it on YouTube, and they had the whole thing there. That might have been what happened.
okay,
I don't remember which one it was, but it was available, and I didn't have to pay for it.
yeah. Now, what makes this documentary so interesting in particular, I think, is the way that the documentary kind of plays out. And it starts off where you're being told about this musician who was performing, and he's on stage, and it's the gig is going bad, and he ends up burning himself alive on stage, and that's how you're introduced to this documentary. And so um, then as it goes on, you get kind of the backstory of this musician, this artist named Sixto Rodriguez, and I'm I can't quite remember if it was like 60s or early 70s. Do you remember off the top of your head, Gavigai, when he was
In
performing?
that
Like,
era, I'm thinking late '70s probably.
okay, but he's he, this musician from Detroit, this folk musician. Um, in the documentary, they kind of make some comparisons to Bob Dylan kind of style, but he's performing in Detroit, and he releases two albums, and they do not sell in the United States, and he kind of fades into obscurity. But um, over in South Africa, there's they have apartheid going on, and somehow, some way, the album Rodriguez's albums pop up in South Africa, and they become very popular over there to the point at one point in the documentary, um, he's in terms of popularity, he's compared to like Elvis or the Beat. Like they say, he's more popular in South Africa than Elvis, but he's like his albums are like the kind of thing that people would have. Like everybody's got a Beatles album, everybody's got a Rodriguez album, and a handful of other things. But everybody in South Africa knows who Rodriguez is in terms of his albums. But nobody over there knows anything about him, and so there's this kind of and because South Africa is such a sanctioned off country at this point in time, um, it's this closed off little community, and so
The
there's
government was Yeah, the government was really restricting media and any kind of print or I don't know, but apparently this, because it came in kind of underground and was proliferated through probably bootleg copies of the album, the government, it kind of went below the radar, and so they didn't they couldn't restrict it or censor it the way they could with other media outlets and things.
well, but they did end up like once it became popular enough, it did end up getting like they had at one point a copy of it that I assume was supposed to be part of like a at a radio station or something, because they did show that like some of the songs had been censored or like scratched, so they were unplayable. Um, but so it was popular enough that it ended up um, where basically, like I said, basically everybody in South Africa has it. But at the same time, South Africa nobody in South Africa realizes that nobody else in the world is aware of this musician. And as I said, there's very little information about Rodriguez for the South Africans. Like basically the only things that they have are the albums themselves, and then the information contained on the albums, which is minimal, which just has a few pictures of Rodriguez and then the names of the songs, and um, it's never fully explained in the documentary, but they point out that on the one album, I think it's his first album, Coldplay, or I'm sorry, Cold Fact. He the songs are said to be written by like 3 different people, but I assume that they're just pseudonyms for Rodriguez, because it's like Sixto something or other, and then something other Rodriguez or something like that. So it seemed, my interpretation was that they were all Rodriguez himself, but he was using pseudonyms. But what I found very interesting about this is because you have this kind of cut off portion of the world, that these myths start building up. Because as you find out through the documentary, eventually somebody from South Africa is able to hunt down information on Rodriguez, and while there's these rumors that Rodriguez has either shot himself while on stage, and it's interesting because the 2 that are portrayed in the film, where either he sets himself on fire on stage or he shoots himself on stage, they have these kind of similar threads where he's performing live on stage and then ends up committing suicide. But somebody from South Africa ends up finding out that Rodriguez, in fact, is still alive in Detroit, living basically in poverty. He's got some sort of construction job, or a job where it's like he's clearing out, more like a demolition job, it sounds like. But he's living, like I said, basically in poverty in a low-income area. They show him at one point, like he heats his house with like a wood stove, and he's fanning the flames with a piece of cardboard. So there's this huge disconnect between Rodriguez and then the way that Rodriguez is viewed in South Africa, and the way South Africa assumes the rest of the world views Rodriguez, because basically everybody in South Africa assumes that Rodriguez is this big celebrity everywhere. But once they find out that he's still alive, somebody gets in contact with Rodriguez, and they bring him over for a concert, and or a set of concerts in South Africa. And for me, it was a very and just an awesome moment when you see Rodriguez, and he's probably one of the most humble people you can imagine. If you get a chance to watch this documentary, but if you can just imagine this man who, and when they bring him back over, it's like in the late 90s, so it's been 25 years at this point since he's stopped, or since he wrote these albums and then just went on to do other things, live his life, and then to find out that he's this huge celebrity in this other part of the world. And as you can imagine, like this, I would assume this sense of disbelief, like when somebody calls you and says, oh yeah, you're huge over in this other part of the world, but then he goes over there and performs this stadium concert for all these cheering fans, and like that moment when they show all these fans just like cheering for him before he comes out onto the stage, that's just an unbelievable, almost unimaginable moment. But to think of going from living in just pure poverty and then having this huge auditorium full of people cheering for you is crazy. But
Right. Well, and one of the other things that they bring out in the film is that just the uh, kind of inspiration that he provided for this generation. He wasn't just like, you know, a super popular pop artist. He really helped motivate a lot of the the youth that grew up listening to him, politically, and it wasn't necessarily the thing that caused the overturn of apartheid by any means, but it helped kind of fan the flames some, and inspired them to reach beyond what the way things were, and question, um, and I'm sure there are many influence in the kind of social change that went on in South Africa during that era. But a lot of people really kind of held him in very high esteem because of what they took to be kind of anthems for their movement to create change and bring down the apartheid.
yeah, he was his music is pretty political at certain points. I took a little bit of in the documentary, all the music within the documentary is songs from Rodriguez's two albums. Um, but and it's a very good documentary just in general. We've kind of spoiled it here, but you should still check it out if you get a chance. Um, but what I took away from it that I think is in connection to our subject at hand here was I found it very interesting the way that this myth and the other you touched on a little bit, and basically the two things that you heard from the people before they knew Rodriguez's that he was alive, and while these kind of myths are floating about, is you heard that he had committed suicide either by shooting himself or burning himself alive um, on stage. But the other thing that comes up is this kind of assumption that how Rodriguez ended up becoming popular, because that is an interesting question of how did this one artist who nobody basically in America or the rest of the world is aware of become, how did that catch fire over there? And there's the assumption is basically that somebody brought over a demo or a bootleg copy at some point in time, and it ended up just catching on. And that's certainly a possibility. There's nothing impossible about that, but chances are that that's not quite right. Just, I mean, there's a number of different ways it could have gone down, and that's the popular assumption that's come up. But like I said, that's probably not what happened. But that is kind of how the story goes at this point, and so that's what people say. But um, I find it interesting when you compare it to what we know or claim to know about Jesus, just in terms of these kind of basic stories, and even like the more conservative in terms of willing to believe in the story. Historians tend to have um, a handful of things, like Bart Ehrman is a good example of things that they would say we can more or less know about Jesus based on the information we have at hand. Um, but how easy it is for even mundane things to, like I said, just this something as simple as how did this uh, Rodriguez albums become popular in South Africa is a mundane thing. There's nothing miraculous about just saying, oh, somebody brought over a bootleg demo and then uh, gave some copies of it to some friends. But just simple things like that can get blown completely. If at any point in the chain of one person tells another, if there's something wrong in that chain, Chinese telephone type of thing, and it's wrong forever at that point. Um, but then when you take
Especially when you have such a closed off
system,
area where they don't have access, right? A system where they don't have access to outside sources of information. um, there's no way that they can check or validate the information that they're getting, and because they get it from someone that they trust, it's they take that and believe it.
yeah, I mean, if the internet didn't exist, South Africa would still be under the impression that Rodriguez had committed suicide. I mean, if somebody from South Africa had wrote a biography or wrote down all the information they had about Rodriguez, it would include those two bits of information that he became popular because somebody brought over a bootleg demo, and then he died when he committed suicide on stage. And that would have been the story that survived in South Africa basically forever. If there was no internet and we went, forward to the point where uh, Rodriguez was dead, and then all the people who were involved with Rodriguez died. Let's jump 100 years into the future. Those stories would have survived in South Africa, and that would have become the history of Rodriguez. But and it does make me wonder about how reliable, especially something as so poorly documented as Jesus is, because you basically have one source, which is the author of Mark, and that's 60 years after the events take place. You have a handful of sayings that supposedly go back to Jesus, and I'm not even somebody who thinks that Jesus didn't exist, but I think it's really questionable about how much any of this stuff links back to reality. Um, uh, but let's if you're ready, I'm ready to move on to talking about Ehrman and his new book.
Sure. Yeah, I think that serves as a good transition. So, for anyone who's not familiar with Bart Ehrman, he is a renowned scholar of New Testament literature and history during the first century in Palestine and the surrounding areas. He's very well read in the original texts, or as close to the original text, those ancient, what's the word that they use?
Manuscripts.
The manuscripts, yes, thank you. And he's fluent in the ancient Greek and I think Aramaic as well, which was the original languages that the Bible was written in. But at any rate, he's written several books, all of which are very good. His latest book that came out in March of this year was titled "How Jesus Became God," and in it he essentially asks the question, well, what can we know about Jesus, and how is it that he came to be viewed as God, the creator of everything? And he lays out in several sections just different pieces of the puzzle. And so he starts off with just kind of the beliefs in that culture and in the surrounding cultures related to humans and the divine realm and things. And Ehrman argues that in this time period there really wasn't the strict divide of natural physical realm that we recognize and the spiritual realm. Everything was kind of intermingled and mixed in the cultures of the ancient Romans and the Greco-Roman world at the time. Um, Gods would appear as mortals in a lot of cases. They would conceive and have children with mortals. And then there were also cases where mortals were perceived as gods or thought to be gods, including emperors and Caesar and things like that. And then there were kind of demigods that were the children of the gods and the humans. Um, but and then he asked the question, well, is there anything like that in the Jewish culture that kind of was the backdrop? And the answer is yes, that they had divine beings of various kind of ranks or in the continuum of from mortal to divine. Being angels, and the angels had different rankings and levels and things, and demons. There were also half-breed humans that they called Nephilim that were supposedly the children of angels and demons, and so the angels came down and had sex with mortals and things. And he also makes a very strong case for the idea that some of the prophets and kings were exalted to godlike status and given status in the Old Testament very similar to the way Jesus is talked about in the New Testament, and how that language of lifting someone up to divine status like that was not foreign or alien to the first century Jews who heard the stories about Jesus. And they also, it was a common belief that when people died, that they would become angels, and he gives textual support for that, both in the Bible and then other writings and things that were circulating around that time as well.
Yeah, it's
Um,
one thing,
Go
if you
ahead.
don't mind me interrupting you for a second, that I wanted to bring up real quick is I it's so liberating once you get away from religion and you're able to look at things at face value, and it's just funny to me how easy to see at this point in time it is for me how things evolve over time. And you're given this view when you're a Christian of these are the ways that we look at this text, and this is how we look at God and how we view God, and this is how He's always been and how we've always dealt with it. But when you actually go back and look at the way, and it's such a bit of mental gymnastics that they have to do to try and acquire that view when you do look at these older things, and that's why you have these apologists trying to deal with slavery and all these things that no one agrees with anymore, but that was fine in those, as far as the hierarchy was concerned. It was fine to have slaves and whatever, um, but it's just interesting to me how different. And if I had a time machine, that's one thing I would want to do, is just jump back in time and then see how people actually viewed these things, viewed God, viewed Jesus in their own times, as opposed to how we assume they did. That's one.
Right.
And
Well, and that's.
I haven't read the
Go
book,
ahead.
but is that something that he deals with?
Yes, yes, and some of his later chapters deal specifically with, well, from the very beginning, the earliest kind of records that we can come up with, to even the centuries after, and how they deal with and how there were competing theories and doctrines about this, and some were considered heresies for a while, and some were considered orthodox, and there was this constant battle kind of between different competing ideas of who Jesus was, when he became the Son of God, and all of these things. And a lot of this is even still reflected in the text of the Bible. So yeah, it's all there. It's a good book. This one, in my opinion, was a little less accessible and kind of more academic than some of his previous books. I read, which I think I've read two of his previous books. I think Misquoting Jesus, and
The other
what's
one
another one that he's.
I've read is Jesus Interrupted. I don't know if
Yes, I think that's the other one that I read as well. Both of those were very easy reads. I mean, pretty much page turners, because I was very intrigued the whole time, and um, just excellent. He's a good writer. He doesn't get technical, and when he does get technical a little bit or touch on something in order to make distinctions that are important, he spells it out in ways that make sense and are digestible. He doesn't use lofty academic language when it's not necessary. So
yeah.
I very much recommend it. Any of his
Um,
books.
yeah, because I even just from I can't probably is from both, but I think if one or the other, I would assume it would be Jesus Interrupted. I know he talks a bit about uh, how in the first Gospels, in terms of when they were written, Mark, and then progressively Matthew and Luke, and then John, you have this kind of evolution of how Jesus is viewed, whereas in Mark, he's very much just a man. But by the time you get to John, he's full-fledged God at that point in time, and it's completely a different view on Jesus. And I think that's part of that mental, and it's that something like that at this point in time isn't difficult for Christians to do because it's built in. But the gymnastics of even
Well,
trying.
and not only that, but it's also, there's this built-in kind of assertion and claim that there's consistency throughout the Gospels, and they all say the same thing. Well, it's because they don't compare them side by side to see what they're saying. They just read bits and pieces from here and there, or they read them one at a time, and kind of work their way through without doing a side by side comparison.
Yeah, I mean, and Ehrman talks about in his other books about how the authors of each of those books had different intentions of what they wanted to say, but that now we go and we take these books and kind of smash them all together to turn them into our own narrative and make it mean what we wanted to say. In joking, when talking to one of my friends, I was saying it'd be kind of like taking Chris Nolan's Dark Knight and Tim Burton's Batman and Adam West and that Batman movie, and then trying to smash those all together because they all have Batman and they all have the Joker. So try and smash those stories all together and then make that all make sense when they clearly all tell very different stories. But yeah, so in getting to kind of the overarching subject there about what was Jesus, a liar, lunatic, liar, lunatic, Lord, legend, or other. Well, I think you can cross both of us off of the Lord category. Bart Ehrman, like when the legend part of that actually comes from, at least from my point of view, comes from Ehrman talking about it. Partially because he brings it up in one of his books where he's talking about how it's kind of a legend that Jesus even claimed to be Lord. And that's something that got attributed to him. Some people misunderstood what Bart Ehrman meant by that and thought that Ehrman thinks that Jesus himself is not a historical figure, um, and is a legend. Ehrman does not hold that view. I personally don't hold that view, but you could kind of break that into two different kinds of legend categories as well. Um, I think it would be very interesting, and that's why I kind of wish I had a time machine so I could go back in time and actually see what this Jesus character was like, and what if he in fact did exist, or if he's kind of a conglomeration of a couple different people, or what. But um, did you want to talk about like C.S. Lewis and Josh McDowell's?
Well, no, I mean, I think I've already said what as much as I was going to say about the two of them, but they both kind of put forward this idea that you have only those three options. That it's Jesus. You have to answer the question: was he a lunatic, and saying that he was God, or was he a liar, and they try and rule out those two options and say, well, the only thing left that you can say is he had to have been the Lord if he wasn't like crazy and he wasn't a liar. And it's a very simplistic way to look at things, because for one thing, there are other options, as you've pointed out, the legend or something else.
Basically,
I
two
don't know
two
what the something
legend
is.
options, but what I kind of wanted to bring up about this is I think that even within the atheist community, and I don't think we should go out of our way to not do this, but there's this kind of assumption or a leaning towards, well, he wasn't a liar. And I mean, we don't know what Jesus actually claimed, and like you say, Bart Ehrman makes a case that he didn't ever make this claim that he was Lord. But even if he didn't make the claim that he was Lord, if there was a historical Jesus, I have an assumption that he probably was making some kind of paranormal claims, one way or the other, whether or not he was claiming to be the full-on God figure that he is now viewed as is somewhat beside the point. But I think it's kind of interesting, because if you were to ask, a random person on the street, Christian or atheist, a Jewish person, uh, basically anybody who isn't a Muslim, if they thought that Muhammad was a liar or a lunatic, or he wouldn't be Lord in that case, but telling the
Prophet.
truth, or
Yeah.
prophet, um, I don't think they would hesitate to say he was either a liar or a lunatic. They might lean one way or the other. And then if you were to ask somebody basically the same question about Joseph Smith, how how easily they would say, yeah, well, he was a pretty well-known liar, and can't rule out that he was at least a little crazy. Sure, why not throw in a little bit of that? Fine. But then when it comes to Jesus, uh, like I said, even within the atheist community, there's this kind of uh, almost reverence, and like, oh, well, I don't want to touch that. But why? It seems like, given what we know about people who make these types of claims from more recent history, it seems pretty likely that they were liars, that they were uh, willing to make up things, that they probably were sociopathic or psychopathic to an extent, um, just kind of um, yeah, just these type of people who don't really care that much about reality and are just looking for attention. Um,
Well, and there, one of the things that he touches on, he's already touched on it a bit, and I think I haven't quite finished the book. I'm almost all the way through, but is during the latter period that he discusses in the book, the next century after the writing of the New Testament books and things. All these different competing Christologies. The Christology means that it's answering the question, well, who was Jesus, in a kind of a metaphysical sense, or and different theologies that were competing, and people that were copying the texts that had leanings one way or another toward one view of who Christ was would make changes and change the text that they copied, so that things that would strengthen their position that they favored, and all the while, at the same time, they were saying you shouldn't do this, it's immoral to do this, and they're doing it. There are people who are scribes and things are copying the text in ways that are intended to favor their views and their positions. So and
Yeah,
it was being done on both sides.
yeah. At one point, I think he mentions, and I forget what was written, but there's this indication that the scribe had written a little note about not changing, like in the liner, like not changing the text or whatever, but in so doing was changing the text, and it does make you wonder whether the people making the changes are doing it kind of with the assumption that they are doing the right thing. It kind of, in my mind, to circle it back all the way to the beginning of this episode, kind of, it's this ends justifying the means. We shouldn't change the text, but I assume somebody before me must have changed this text, so I'm changing it back. Because this doesn't quite fit with what I know to be the truth of my theology, of my view of this religion, so this can't be right. What I'm seeing on this paper and I'm copying can't be right, so I'm going to quick make this edit to fix it. So, but even beyond that, to get down to, and we don't know exactly what Jesus said and what he believed, but in my opinion, I just think that I think it's probably safe to assume to some extent that Jesus was probably at least a little bit of a liar and possibly a little bit of a lunatic. If he wasn't, Paul most certainly was, I would say. But anyway, that about sums up my thoughts on the topics at hand. Do you have anything else you want to touch on?
No, I think that pretty well does it. I do recommend reading the book if you have any interest in that subject at all. I do also want to just note that when I first got out of high school, I wanted to go to college, and I wanted to go to a Christian school, because that was important to me. I wanted to be away from the temptation of the secular world or whatever at that time, and I took classes on the New Testament, and even at this relatively conservative Christian school from an evangelical denomination, all these things were taught, and it's just looking back at that and remembering, oh yeah, I remember now that they mentioned this, that there's this discrepancy in the original texts, or that there's this progression of from a lower Christology saying that Jesus was born a man essentially, but then he was exalted to the status of the Son of God at various times. In Mark, it's at his baptism, and then it keeps getting pushed back until in John he's always existed and has always been God from the very beginning and things. Well, I knew all of that stuff, or I had learned it at one point, and I guess when I heard it at that time, I just didn't believe it. It's bizarre how much we can kind of gloss over these things that are very important to what we believe, and I think that's why it's always important to examine and be contemplative and re-examine your own beliefs to try and avoid falling into that trap of confirmation bias that you only believe the things that and only even see the evidence that fits into your worldview and your picture.
That's a very interesting thing you bring up there. I'm curious. I wonder if part of what makes you able to overlook that the discrepancy is the context of the situation, because you're at this evangelical school, and you're being taught this information by somebody who believes relatively close to the same things that you do. Um, if because of that context you're able to say, well, it must not be a real problem then. This guy knows it, and he doesn't have a problem with it, and so there's this kind of subconscious like, but it doesn't seem to matter, so I can just move on.
Right. If he's smart and he knows about it and it doesn't shake his faith, then why should it bother me? I'll just make note of it, circle the answers that are correct on the test and then go on, right?
Yeah, that's very
Yeah, I think
interesting.
that's a big part of it.
Very interesting. All right, well, I think that about wraps episode 6 up. Um, yeah, we will be back. I don't. You want to just keep going on Sunday mornings here, because it seems to work out pretty consistently well for us.
Sure.
All right, so I think we'll try and keep up these Sunday mornings, and we'll be back next week. I'm not sure what our topics will be, but we'll get that figured out. Good talking to you again, Gavagai.
Good talking to you, Turtle.
All right, we'll see you later.
Atheist Brothers out.